their power to their own advantage. Okay? So there's going to be this competition in order to do what? Limit the potential abuse of those countries that have too much power, right? So countries then begin to enter into these alliances, into these agreements to do what? To make sure that power is evenly distributed. And the argument is that you will not have war as long as what? There exists a balance of power. So in other words, peace, okay, basically peace means no war. Peace will be enabled and maintained as long as no single individual or single bloc or a single country or single group of countries has more power than the other. So it is in the interest of the system, or if it's in the interest of those countries within a system to achieve that kind of equilibrium. You guys with me so far? So typically when you have one or two countries that are very powerful, other countries have to do something about it. Because if you adopt this kind of realist, neuralist point of view, okay, the argument is the only way you can protect yourself is if you have power. And if you don't have power on an individual, as an individual country, you have to seek out like-minded countries and then, of course, enter into those into agreements. But that kind of makes it very ambiguous, right? When you really think about it, it's like this whole notion of balance of power. But by and large, this is what drove thinking in the latter part of the 20th century, particularly when we looked at this relationship between the Soviet Union and the USSR. You had a bipolar world. You had one pole, that is the United States and everybody around it, and then you had another pole, you had the Soviet Union, everybody, and all the countries around it. And you had a couple of non-aligned states, but they were relatively insignificant in terms of they didn't really add to this whole power, to this logic of trying to establish this balance of power. But the bottom line is this is how individuals thought, or this is what drove thinking. So if you think about, now, and I think I've mentioned this before, and this balance of power wasn't just something that we looked on a global level, but also it had relevance on a regional level. For example, you had President Nasser, right, of Egypt. He was aligned with the president of Syria, right? And what did the United States with Israel attempt to do, particularly after Nasser was passed on and the new president came? What was the whole objective? What did the United States, what did Henry Kissinger under President Nixon do? Yes?
They wanted to break the alliance.
Break the alliance. Why? Because collectively Syria and Egypt were a power were a power to be respected by Israel, right? And if somehow you could separate Egypt from Syria, okay, and then perhaps, and in this case, Egypt with Anwar Sadat essentially decided to kind of enter in some sort of alliance with the United States and Israel, and then that's isolated the president of Syria, right? But now Syria on its own was no longer a serious threat to Israel, and from the U.S. point of view, being the support of Israel after World War II, that was something that was being pushed by the United States. So the whole point here is you have, as soon as you're weak, you potentially invite attack. To prevent attack, you have to do what? You have to engage in countervailing power activities in order to kind of maintain that kind of balance of power. And if balance of power is achieved and sustained, then that pretty much ensures peace. Why do you think? Why was the United States and the USSR constantly trying to? We're constantly building more and more weapons. Where you could, if you read history books, you critics of, let's say the anti-nuclear weapon movement, they would argue against this idea that why does the United States need enough weapons to destroy the world 10 times? Or why does the USSR need, weapons to destroy the world 10 times? Why, from a neo-realist point of view, why would that make sense?
Because it gives them power to threat.
Hmm?
It
Yeah, but why do you need 10 times more power?
So that you would be the only dominant.
Well, okay, but if I have 10 nuclear weapons that can destroy the world 2 times over, why do I need 10 more nuclear weapons? Now I can basically destroy the world 4 times, right? Why don't I just stay with, you know, enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world twice over? Yeah.
Because if there's another country that's creating nuclear weapons, it needs to be one. It needs to have more.
Well, and but then there may be other countries. I mean, as soon as India got the got a nuclear weapon, what had to happen? Pakistan had to have one, right? And that's one of the dangers that they say here in this part of the world is if Iran gets nuclear weapons, that means, let's say Saudi Arabia wants to get a nuclear weapon. Okay, so what you have is you have this kind of argument that the balance of power has changed. Now, from a neo-realist point of view, is if the USSR can destroy the world 4 times over, and the United States can destroy the world twice over, who's more powerful? USSR. Therefore, what does the United States have to do?
Build more.
Build more. And if they have more weapons than the USSR, what does the USSR have to do? Now that kind of takes that logic to the extreme and maybe sounds a bit absurd, okay? And eventually, you know, they began to kind of enter into these nuclear deterrence treaties where they began to basically, let's say, slow down the growth of nuclear weapons to where they entered into these nuclear reduction treaties where they began to reduce and destroy nuclear weapons, okay? But anyway, the point here is that this is really the kind of logic that drove foreign policy at the turn of the latter part of the 20th century. Now, in terms of this kind of balance of power, there's a transaction cost. It costs money, okay? And meaning, what do you mean by it costs money? Well, you got to pay attention to what the other country's doing, right? And anyway, you have to have observers. You got to monitor. You know, one of the classic examples that I like to cite is when I graduated college, I had a summer staff assistantship on the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, otherwise known as the Helsinki Commission, which was a commission that was formed by Congress to monitor the Helsinki Accords. The Helsinki Accords were basically was a treaty that was signed by 150. I can't believe I remember this. 156 countries. That's what 2 months in Washington does. It etches certain numbers in your brain for the rest of your life. 156 signatory nations this happened under President Jimmy Carter, okay? And what happened was that this is the first time that human rights were elevated to the level of international affairs. Prior to the Helsinki Accords, pretty much no one cared about I shouldn't say no one cared. No one really paid. The issue of human rights was a domestic matter, okay? And people focused mainly on security and economics. And the Helsinki Accords consisted of 3 baskets: the security basket, the economics basket, and the human rights basket. So what happened is you entered into this kind of treaty where everybody agreed to kind of abide by the criteria, by the rules of the treaty, but in order to make sure everybody was following through with their promise, you needed to have what? A commission. And then the commission would then monitor, you know, are the Soviets or anyone else who signed the treaty, are they following when it comes to security matters? Are they paying attention to economic matters? And in this case, are they paying attention to human rights issues? Okay? So you have to you got to pay attention. So you got to stay vigilant. And now these are some other examples that the book talks about in terms of be moderate. And, when we talk about rules for effective balancing power, be moderate in victory. In other words, don't overkill. Okay, don't overkill. If you're going to, you don't vanquish the foe. Okay, because if you vanquish the foe, what typically happens? You then begin to harbor resentment, which then is going to do what? Inspire the country to do what? To basically rebuild and come back and basically save face in the future. So these are just different kind of concepts that the book talks about. Now, balance of power is not the only type of approach towards maintaining peace within the system. Now, keep in mind, this is all about maintaining stability within the system. So, from the balance of power point of view, what you typically have is you have, as long as power is evenly distributed, there's a balance of power, peace will be maintained. Now, when I was looking at this PowerPoint, I wanted to kind of emphasize one of the, I think, very important criticisms of balance of power theory is this worst case scenario planning. In other words, when you begin to think about how you're going to respond to, let's say, some sort of act at one part of the country, you have to think in terms of contingencies. What if they do this? What if they do that? And typically what happens is when you begin to engage in this kind of utopian kind of logic, what occurs is you have to pay attention to the worst case scenario, which means you have to assume that the USSR is capable of launching nuclear weapons. Okay, and that becomes a serious problem, because now you're assuming that something on the table is something that could be so devastating, so drastic. Okay? Another thing which is important, and this is one of the criticisms that's levied today, is that it assumes that decision makers are risk averse. You guys know what risk aversity means? Who knows what risk aversity means? I mean, you were good, yeah.
They're against taking chances.
Yeah, they're afraid to take chances. Very good. Afraid to take chances. Very good. Very good. In other words, if I know that you can blow me up or obliterate me, all right, and that you can respond with enough firepower to destroy parts of my country, I am more likely or less likely to attack you.
Can you repeat that?
If I know that if I attack you, your response will pretty much destroy me, am I more likely or less likely to attack? Less likely. That's what that basically means. All right? And one of the criticisms that is levied today is the fact that some people argue, which I tend to be somewhat skeptical about it, because I don't think any country wants to launch any attack, okay, at the expense of its survival. Just, to me, it doesn't make sense. But the point is that people argue that some countries don't care what happens to them. And that's a little bit, but that's more on the extreme. These are some people on the margin who actually kind of, they talk about them as believing in an apocalyptic foreign policy. That is, they want the apocalypse to occur. They want something tragic to occur. And that tends to be those who kind of buy into this whole religious argument that you need some sort of apocalypse for a second coming. Let's say in the case of some of the more radical Christian groups out there, particularly in the United States. But anyway, the point here is that these are some of the assumptions, and that it assumes that decision makers are risk averse, worst case scenario, and then of course, this is also very important, that is, you're assuming that you have all your information is accurate, okay? And that's a problem, right? Because what do we know about perfect information? It doesn't exist, right? There's no such thing as perfect information, okay? Now, alternatives to balance of power, this is a common one, hegemonic stability theory. You know, why should countries spend all this money on weapons, okay, and military hardware, when they can rely on others to take care of them, right? And typically, as long as you have one country who has this power position, who maintains this role of a referee, and is pretty much comfortable, okay, pretty much comfortable being that referee, making sure everybody plays by the rules of the game, then stability will be ensured, okay? And if someone is challenged or someone is picked on, this referee is going to come in and do what? Protect the country from some aspiring bull. So typically,